In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use spreadsheets to perform large amounts of calculations. What a spreadsheet basically is just a series of grids that can contain data and then can perform calculations on this data. Before I start, just for visibility purposes, I'm going to actually grab a few of these cells and change their formatting a little bit. I'm going to make them a little bit bigger so that the typing will be a 14-point font so you can see it just a little bit better. Now what you'll notice is that as I click around in these cells, it just activates a little bit, activates each cell one at a time. And you'll notice that this little dot is here. I'll explain what that purpose is in a moment, but it's an extremely important feature. Now, if you notice, I'm currently in cell A1, and I could type a number in there, for example, the number 1. And then I can click down here in A2 and type in 2. I can put whatever number I want. Now notice as I'm typing, the typing shows up over here also. This is going to show what's actually in the cell. Right now we see nothing's in there. When I click here, I see the number 1. If I want to edit, I actually can't type right. I'm sorry, I can type here, but I don't actually normally see the cursor here. What I normally do is if I want to edit something, I generally edit it up here. So I can add a whole bunch of things here, letters, numbers, pictures if I wanted to. But that doesn't really do much just by simply adding that. The power of a spreadsheet is to perform calculations and to sort through data. So what we're going to do today is show you how you can basically simply sort through your data. So the first thing you'll want to do is whenever you're working on a spreadsheet, in this case I'm using Google Drive or Google Sheets to do this. You could do this with Microsoft Excel also, or any other variety of spreadsheet program. But if I click on here, it's probably logical to give it a name. So today we're just going to show you how to do the famous Newton's second law. Oops, I'll retype that correctly. And let's say we were doing a lab in which we were basically collecting a bunch of masses and resulting accelerations, and we wanted to calculate the force that went with it. This is a way of doing it. So in this class we'll collect large amounts of data for various experiments, and quite often it'll be easier to let the computer do the calculation rather than manually entering all these values in the calculator. All you have to do is make sure you have it correct. So hopefully, as you're aware, Newton's second law is the law that mass times acceleration. Now this mass would be in kilograms. And this acceleration would be typically done in meters per second squared. So we can type this in. Now, what we're typing in here really doesn't matter. In fact, what you'll notice is that this B1 content actually flows into C1. It doesn't matter. It's just a visibility thing. When I type in C1's values and I say force, which would be measured in newtons, it actually seems to cut that information off. It doesn't really, because if I click on B1, I still see the content is in here. And if for any reason I wanted to copy and paste values, it's just going to take the content that's in the cells, not what's necessarily viewable, but what actually is properly added to the cell. So we should be aware that mass times acceleration equals force. So what we're going to want to do is perform a bunch of force calculations without having to manually type the numbers over and over and over again in the calculator and worry about any pressing of buttons. So let's say for in this example, in this experiment, I measured a mass of 1.1 kilograms, set it up in a way that it had an acceleration, and I had a sensor that monitored a acceleration of 2.3 meters per second squared. Then I reran the experiment under new conditions, and I had a mass of 2.4 kilograms that resulted in an acceleration of 3.5 meters per second squared. And then let's say we did it one more time with a mass of 0.3 kilograms and ended up with an acceleration of 3.3 meters per second squared. What we see here is we have a couple of data points. Now, it's not many. This would be pretty easy to put in the calculator by itself, but it can get really elaborate, particularly if an equation is really involved. Sorry about that. Or there's a bunch of different objects that are involved that we'll have to keep track of separately. This becomes much, much easier than just simply doing it in the calculator. So here's how it goes. We said before that mass times acceleration equals force, and we want this cell to do that calculation for us. So what we see here is, this is blank at the moment, but I can now type this in. When I hit the equal sign pretty much says, all right, this cell is now a calculator. It's going to need to perform a calculation, and we just stated that force is calculated as mass times acceleration. So what I'm going to do is take this mass value. I'm going to times it. Now that is going to be Shift 8 on most keyboards, or you could use the asterisk key on the number pad. But you want to say that you want to multiply what's the content of this cell by the content of this cell. So A2 contained the mass B2 containing an acceleration, and if we multiply those two things, it should lead to our force. And if we hit equals, we see that we get a value here. Now I can show more decimals if I like by clicking on this, or show less values if I would like by clicking here. I tend to use 3 sig figs, so this is typically how I do it, although properly speaking, from your chemistry days, you probably learned that it should be 2 sig figs because this only used 2 and this only used 2. Now, if I want to perform this calculation over and over again, I could actually reprogram it. I could hit equals and then times these 2 cells, but that's where this little button this little dot that I mentioned before comes in. This is basically a formatting paster, and what it says is that if I drag this down to the next cell, what we will notice is if I click on the cell, it automatically understood that I wanted to multiply column A and B together, but now that I'm on row 3, it specified A3 times B3, and it performed the calculation of this times this equaling this. Again, notice here the color codes are telling me that I multiplied A3 by B3. Now, the next, notice it didn't do it here, and that's because I didn't drag this down. So if I drag this down 1, you will see that now it says it's A4 times B4. So what this will do is it's just going to basically perform the calculation for me. So if I decided to just drag this down further, I'll see I have no values yet, but it's ready to do the calculation because it says let's take the contents of A5 and B5 and multiply them, although there's no values in there. So once I put my first value, for example, let's say I had a mass of 1 and then an acceleration of 1, 2 easy numbers, so we'll know what this gets. That should give us an expected value here of 1. And if I did 2 times 2, I would get an expected value of 4. And what we see here is that this simply performs calculations for us. Now, if I was working in another document, I could simply copy and paste this info if I wanted to. I could manually type it. I could do whatever it is that I want, but this will perform the basic calculations for me. All right, now if you notice, there's a bunch of other tools up here. I'm not going to get into these right now. But these little tools would allow you to format it as if you were formatting a Word document. You could use any font or anything you like. But basically, hopefully this tutorial helped you in understanding how you can use a spreadsheet to perform a calculation.